Good morning. Almost none of the ethical teachings of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus that he gives on how we are to live, how we are to relate to those around us, almost none of them are unique to Jesus. Some of them he is directly quoting other sources. Others, he's going over ground that has been trod by other religious and philosophical teachers. The core of his teaching, of course, is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. A direct quotation from the book of Deuteronomy. He continues on, love your neighbor as yourself. A direct quote from the book of Leviticus. There are other religious teachers who talk about prayer, who talk about forgiveness. There are other philosophical teachers who talk about how one would live. The one teaching of Jesus that we know for sure is unique to him, where he broke new ground, is when he says, love your enemies and pray for those who abuse you, those who persecute you. Other religious teachers, philosophers talked about love and talked about enemies and how you are to regard your enemies. No one said, love your enemy, until Jesus did. And because this is Jesus's one unique teaching, that is obviously why for the past 2,000 years, we Christians have found it just really easy to love our enemies. We just love to pick them up and squeeze their cheeks and pat them on the back. Yeah, famously we've done this, right? In fact, the lesson that Peter just read a few moments ago is sort of a who's who of very easy teachings like turn the other cheek and do not judge and do not condemn. This is a tough one. I want to talk today about love your enemy, though. And so I want to say something about love. I want to say something about enemies, and I want to say something about prayer. I had a parishioner years ago came to me. She was upset. She was upset mostly with the Archbishop of Canterbury, as one usually is. But she was particularly upset because we were praying for the Archbishop of Canterbury by name every week, as we do here at St. David's when we have an Archbishop of Canterbury. That's a whole other thing. So I said to her, do you consider the Archbishop of Canterbury to be your enemy? And she bristled at that. Like, no, I just don't like him. I don't respect him. I don't agree with him, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, well, Jesus says for us to love our enemy, so maybe we could pray for the Archbishop of Canterbury. And she agreed, but then she said, but how do you do that? How do you love your enemy? That is not typically what we think about when it comes to love. There are the people that we have in our lives that we might finish a conversation, perhaps finish a conversation on the phone with the words, I love you. There are people that we have when we write a note or a card or an email or a text that we might finish those with, love you, love, XOXO. And then there are the people that we wouldn't do that with. Now, there are some people that obviously we're not going to do that with. We're not going to tell the telemarketer, love you, before we hang up on them. But we typically reserve our understanding for love for those people who are closest to us. The people who are sometimes most like us, the people that we perhaps agree with us. When Jesus says, love your enemy, he's stretching that. He tells us to love God, of course, to love our neighbor as ourself, and so we're to love ourself as well, and to love our enemy. He holds all of these groups under the rubric of love, which tells me that Jesus' understanding of love is broader than our own. And the people who are to fall under the umbrella of love is to be larger than what we typically think of our umbrella of love, including. I have 2 daughters, and as daughters are wont to do, sometimes they get into it. Sometimes there's a spat, sometimes hair flies, and, depending on what they're arguing about, I might side with one over the other, right? I might think one's more right than the other is. But even though I side with one, I still love them both. Love there transcends who is right or wrong. I think the start of loving our enemies has something to do with regarding other people and the people who are our enemies, or the people that we find it really, really hard to like or to be around. I think it has something to do with seeing them as God sees them. Not as the person we think is right or wrong or in or out, but see that person as a child of God. And if they're a child of God, then also our sibling, our brother, our sister. That's something about love. I want to say something about enemies. This is a little quicker. I think when Jesus tells us to love our enemies, I think it's a short way of saying that we are not supposed to have enemies. Because as soon as you start loving somebody, can you really say that they're your enemy anymore? As soon as you start seeing them not as the person you disagree with, the person whose ideals you can't stand behind, but you see them as a fellow child of God, as a sibling, are they any more your enemy? Haven't they crossed out of the boundary of enemy? As followers of Jesus, whose central teachings come around love, hatred is not an option for us. Disagreement? Sure. Lots of conversation, uncomfortable conversation? Sure. But hatred? No. And I think enemies? No. By enemies, I don't just mean groups of people. We're not talking about Al-Qaeda. We're not talking about, the Kansas City Chiefs. We're talking about individuals, people who stand before us, them. Hatred is not allowed. Which brings me to the last thing, prayer. You will all probably remember Jesus on the cross. And there's a whole group of people who are before him, who are actively crucifying him. And some of them have been actively persecuting him for days and weeks, hoping for this moment, working for this moment of suffering and death. And Jesus, there on the cross, says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Those words, that verse, has launched a million sermons, which go something along the lines of, look at how great Jesus is at forgiving. He forgives even the people who are crucifying him. And that's not exactly what's going on there, if you look a little closer. Jesus does not say, "Hey guys, I forgive you." Jesus says, "Father, forgive them." What is it called when you talk to God? What do we call that? Prayer. What is Jesus doing? He is praying for the people who are persecuting him. As I've given this sermon, you might have thought in your head about who your enemies are. You might have some pictures, some images. You might have names. You might have faces. You might have bristled at the word enemy and said, I don't really have enemies, but there are people that I don't like very much, and there are people who are hard to be around. I know loving your enemies is a hard thing to grasp. But maybe the first place to start is by praying for them. And we are not praying that they fall down a long flight of steps. We're not praying that some terrible thing would befall them. We are offering them up to God. This person who we do not agree with, this person that we cannot get our head around, this person that boils our blood every time we see them or think of them, we take this child of God, this brother, this sister of ours, and we offer them to God. Love your enemies. And pray for those who persecute you. It's not easy, but I think the first step is not so bad. Amen.